just didn't have the voice. They would have to change the key maybe 5 notes down, and it would sound horrible. So when Frankie did things on TV, he would always lip sync towards the end.
What happened to Frankie Lyman? Why is his story so sad? Frankie Lyman was a famous singer when he was just a teenager. He became a star with his group, the Teenagers.
Why do birds sing so gay?
But what went wrong in his life? Why did he fall into trouble? How did his fame fade away so quickly? Let's take a closer look at Frankie Lyman's life and the sad events that happened to him.
Baby, baby, how I want you, baby, baby.
Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers were the start of something special in the music world. They were the first boy band that changed the music scene, and Frankie, just 13 years old, was the star. Growing up in the tough area of Harlem, Frankie had to be strong from a young age. His family was musical, and his parents were part of a gospel group. Frankie and his brothers loved to sing, and that helped him find his way into the music world.
He was just a natural born talent. He was born for the stage. And it only lasted a short time, I guess it'll plague me the rest of my life.
But life wasn't easy for Frankie. Fame came fast, and it was hard for him to handle. He had a tough childhood in a poor neighborhood, and by the time he was 11, he was already working to help his family. He said there was no time to be a child because he had to work like an adult. He was working in the grocery store, helping pay rent on top of that at a young age.
We sang on that corner every day of the week, all day long. Grocery store where Frankie worked, the window above of the store Richard Barrett lived in. He lived in that apartment.
Frankie was already engaging in activities even most adults wouldn't dare do as a kid. He was hustling. During an interview, he said, "I remember when I was 10, I made a good living hustling prostitutes for white men that would come up to Harlem looking for black girls. He got paid commission for every customer." Frankie wasn't just using his grocery store job to help his family. He also had dreams of music. Growing up, King Pot was a popular place for kids in his neighborhood. It was where teenagers gathered, and Frankie was no different. He started his musical journey when he was young. He joined a church group, learned some skills, and even started playing the drums. One day at school, Frankie saw a group called the Cudaville performing at a talent show. The Cudaville was a local doo-wop group made up of black and Puerto Rican kids. Frankie loved their sound and begged them to let him join. After months of asking, just before his 13th birthday, they agreed. At first, Frankie wasn't the lead singer. He was a backup singer in a group that went through several name changes. From the Premiers to the Harmonies and finally the Teenagers, they settled on their name. Frankie wasn't the lead singer at first. He was just a backup singer.
Now, no one knew in the group, at least I didn't know, that was the Richard Barrett of the Valentines, who later came to our rehearsal in Stitt Junior High School, where we went, and liked us so much that he took us down to the same recording company where he was making records.
Frankie's mother would shout, "Frankie, it's 9, time to come home." But one day, something amazing happened. A famous singer named Richard Barnett from the group The Valentines moved into their neighborhood. Frankie and his friends saw a chance and decided to sing for him. They didn't expect much, but when Richard heard their voices, he was shocked. He knew they had talent and agreed to take them to G Records for an audition.
I asked him, I said, "I want you to record these kids for me, do 2 sides." He said, no kids, I don't want the problem with the school board, the whole business, just the whole business. I said, all right, I can understand it.
At first, the record company didn't want to sign them. They were just kids, and the company worried about the school board's rules. But then, something surprising happened. Lyman's voice in particular impressed the owner, George Goldner. George said they could record as long as Frankie was the lead singer. But since the kids were so young, they needed their parents to sign the contract. 3 lawyers helped make sure the kids got an allowance, and the rest of the money went into a trust until they turned 21. This deal helped the kids get their start in the music industry.
I walked away, and I got back uptown. I said, how can I tell these kids you don't want to record them because they're too young? They sing, they're in show business. As far as I was concerned, they had a talent. And then we made a deal. I'll rehearse your group, George, if you record mine. The kids went in and did.
Their group was different from other bands at the time, and their style would later influence famous groups like the Jackson 5 and many Motown artists. But there was a twist to their first hit. Their first song was originally called Why Do the Birds Sing So Gay? One day while practicing in the hallway, a man came out of his apartment and complained. He was tired of hearing them sing the same song over and over. So he gave them a poem called Why Do Birds Sing So Gay? Frankie and his friend Herman Santiago worked on the poem and changed it into a new song called Why Do Fools Fall in Love?
Tell me why.
This song became a big hit. It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart and even went #1 in the UK. The kids were famous and their voices were heard around the world. But sadly, the rest of the teenagers never got paid properly for their work.
Why do birds sing so gay?
Back in the 1950s, Frankie and the Teenagers were the hottest thing in music. Girls would show up wherever the band was, just to catch a glimpse of Frankie. Before long, they were traveling all across America, performing in all 48 states and playing in some of the biggest theaters and on TV. Frankie and the Teenagers were groundbreaking. They appealed to everyone, no matter their background, black, white, or Hispanic. They became one of the first true crossover groups. Boris Levy, one of the owners of G Records, became their manager. But things took a turn in 1956 when he played a role in breaking up the group. Before that, Frankie and the Teenagers released 9 hit singles and performed at massive rock and roll shows. During their tours, Frankie got close to Zola Taylor, a member of another famous group, the Platters. They became romantically involved despite their 5-year age gap. Frankie's relationships became a big part of his life, and he later admitted he had a preference for older women, usually around 25 or older. He said he avoided teenage fans because they didn't understand life, and he found older women less trouble and more rewarding. Frankie had a clever way of avoiding scandals. He would introduce his girlfriends as his mother or older sister to protect his image. His managers wanted him to appear as a wholesome teen idol. His first big romance was with a nightclub dancer. She would sometimes join him on tour and pose as his mother. Frankie recalled how they met. She came up to me at a party, pinched my cheek, and called me cute. I told her she looked good too, and that's how it started. Over time, Frankie became known for having girlfriends in different cities, which was the talk of show business. Despite his clean image on stage, Frankie's private life was full of excitement, romance, and controversy.
He just didn't have the voice. They would have to change the key maybe 5 notes down, and it would sound horrible. So when Frankie did things on TV, he would always lip sync towards the end.
He couldn't handle the pressure of being a solo star. Now it came to a point where Frankie Lyman almost got exposed for pretending to have 2 different mothers. Here's the story. While touring, a newspaper reporter who had met one of Frankie's mothers in New York also ran into another mother in Chicago. The problem? These 2 women didn't look anything alike. Frankie had to convince the reporter that they were the same person, which wasn't easy. At the same time, Frankie's manager, George Goldner, realized how much people loved Frankie. Goldner started promoting Frankie as a solo star, giving him separate gigs without the rest of his group, the Teenagers. This caused big problems in the group. Touring in Europe, tensions boiled over. Goldner also made shady business moves. He sold his share of G Records to a mobster named Morris Levy, but not before taking credit for a song that 2 members of the group, Frankie and Herman Santiago, had written during the tour. To make matters worse, Goldner hired a random group to sing background vocals for one of Frankie's solo songs, Miracle in the Rain, but released it under the name Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. The group was furious. The Teenagers felt ignored. Frankie got all the interviews, all the attention, and all the glory, even when the group was still together. This led to fistfights and threats of strikes during their European tour. By the time they returned to the US, everything fell apart. In September 1957, Frankie officially left the Teenagers to go solo. The rest of the group tried to continue as a quartet without Frankie, but they never found the same success. They released a song called Flip Flop with a new lead singer, but it completely failed. The Teenagers were out of show business. Frankie, on the other hand, had a strong start to his solo career. His song, My Girl,
There's no other girl in the whole wide world than my girl.
became a decent hit, And he even performed on the popular TV show, The Ed Sullivan Show, with another song, Goody Goody.
So you met someone to set you back on your heel. Goody, goody, so you met...
It seemed like Frankie was on top of the world. But here's the sad part. Frankie wasn't ready to handle the pressure of being a solo star. He struggled without the support of his group. Meanwhile, the teenagers couldn't make it without Frankie either. The team that once created magic together had been completely torn apart.
There would be a time in his later years when he would have been able to understand what he was doing and what his worth was, but nobody was going to stop and tell him then. They were too busy taking his money from him. Who's going to tell you what you're worth if they're putting it in their own pockets? You follow me?
Frankie's solo career lasted longer, but it didn't go far because of bad decisions and poor management. Frankie had a clean, innocent image in public, but the truth was much darker. He struggled with addiction from a young age, and this hurt both his career and his life. Frankie started using drugs at a very young age. By the time he was just 15 years old and entering show business, he had already become addicted to heroin. This was the 1950s, and drugs like heroin were ruining the lives of many people, including musicians. Frankie's introduction to heroin was heartbreaking. He was at a party in New York City, surrounded by musicians. A woman nearly twice his age showed him how to use a needle to inject the drug. At first, he only tried skin popping, which is pricking the skin for a mild effect. Frankie admitted he knew heroin was dangerous, but he thought he could control it. "I never intended to get hooked," Frankie said later. "At first, I was content to just skin pop, but soon I got daring. It wasn't long before I was injecting it straight into my veins." Frankie's addiction hurt his music career. Once his record sales went down and people discovered he was using drugs, the music industry turned its back on him. Frankie, once a star, became a name that nobody wanted to be associated with. On top of that, his voice began to change as he grew older. No one wanted to work with him during this transition. By the time he was 17, no booking agents, recording companies, or nightclubs wanted anything to do with him. Frankie also faced a unique challenge. Most people didn't know he was black. During the late 1950s, many people listened to music on the radio or through records. When Frankie appeared on national TV for the first time, the audience was surprised to see he was black. The TV executives were so worried about how people might react that they hired police to keep the crowd calm. Frankie stayed professional despite the awkward situation. Things got even worse in July 1957. Frankie appeared on a TV show called The Big Beat. During one live broadcast, he danced with a white woman. Many people in the South were furious about this. The backlash was so strong that the show was canceled and all evidence of it was destroyed. This event left Frankie's career in an even worse place.
This tall. When he was this tall, he had his first $1 million love. Why do fools fall in love? Talking about the one, the only, the great rockaway now, Frankie Lyman!
In 1960, Frankie tried to quit drugs. He had a lot of bad influences around him, but there was one person who cared. His road manager, Bob Red Cross. Bob treated Frankie like a son. He told Frankie stories about other entertainers who had lost their lives to addiction. To help Frankie get clean, Bob made him move into his house on Long Island so he could keep an eye on him. Frankie started making progress. For a while, he was staying away from drugs. But then a personal tragedy broke him. His mother, who had been sick for over a year, passed away. She had terminal cancer, but didn't know how serious her illness was. Frankie and his family decided not to tell her the truth. She believed she would get better. One of the last things Frankie's mother asked him was if he was staying clean. Frankie told her, "Mama, don't worry. I'm doing the best I can. Bob's taking good care of me." 4 months later, she passed away. Her death left Frankie heartbroken.
He just didn't have the voice. They would have to change the key maybe 5 notes down, and it would sound horrible. So when Frankie did things on TV, he would always lip sync towards the end.
By the time he was 18, he was using drugs again to deal with his pain. His career was in trouble. He even had to lip sync on TV because his live performances weren't good. At 19, he went to rehab, hoping to quit drugs, but it didn't work. His record label dropped him, and he spent the next few years trying to get clean, but kept falling back into heroin. In 1965, Frankie tried to reunite with the teenagers, but it didn't work out. He worked with different record companies like 20th Century Fox Records and Columbia Records, but none of it lasted. His friends said it was heartbreaking to see him at his lowest point. He wasn't the same Frankie they knew. Yes, he was always a bit of a brat and full of himself, but now he was just another struggling man. When he couldn't get work, Frankie would go to booking offices, begging for jobs. He would remind the owners of who he used to be, but most people just felt sorry for him. In 1965, he made his last TV appearance, and it was clear how far he had fallen. He looked sick, missing a tooth, and his skin showed signs of drug abuse. Frankie roamed the streets of New York, asking old friends for money to buy drugs. He even slept on subway cars, his hollow eyes and messy appearance making him unrecognizable. Drug dealers saw him as an easy target and followed him around backstage when he managed to find work. In February 1966, Frankie was arrested for stealing a set of drums and pawning them to pay for drugs. He denied the charges, but admitted to some lies. Just a few months later, in June 1966, he was arrested again for heroin. By this time, Frankie would do almost anything to keep his addiction going. The boy who once had the world at his feet was now a man fighting demons he couldn't escape. It was a tragic end to a promising life.
He was missing a tooth, his skin was in bad shape, and he was forced to have lip sync. It was sad for most of his fans to witness.
One of the biggest betrayals he faced was from a man named Boris Levy. Levy bought the publishing rights to Frankie's songs for just $1,500. Those rights later became worth millions of dollars, but Frankie never saw any of it. Frankie also struggled in his personal life. He married his first wife, Elizabeth Waters, in 1964. They had a baby, but sadly, their daughter died after just 2 days. Their marriage ended, and Frankie moved to Los Angeles. There, he reconnected with Zona Taylor, a woman he had known since he was 13. Zona loved Frankie deeply, but his drug addiction destroyed their relationship. They got married in Mexico, but it didn't last. At one point, Frankie's life took a serious turn. A judge gave him a choice: join the army or go to jail. While stationed at Fort Gordon, Georgia, Frankie met a school teacher named Mia Eagle. She became his third wife and gave him hope for a fresh start. But Frankie couldn't leave his old habits behind. He often went AWOL, absent without leave, to perform at local bars, which eventually got him a dishonorable discharge from the Army. Despite his struggles, Frankie wanted to rebuild his music career. With his wife's support, he moved to New York to live with his grandmother in Harlem. A man named Sam Bray helped him sign with Big Apple Records, but Frankie faced an uphill battle. His new manager wasn't wealthy, just a food inspector trying to help. Nightclub owners and promoters were wary of working with Frankie because of his past addiction. Months before his death, Frankie gave one last interview. He said, "I know many people don't believe I've quit drugs, but I know I have, and that's what matters." Sadly, he never got the chance to prove them wrong.
In 1955, 5 young friends from the Washington Heights section of New York went into a recording studio and changed the sound of pop music forever. Led by a 13-year-old singing and dancing dynamo, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers added a rock and roll beat to the doo-wop sound and brought vocal harmony singing into the modern age.
One faithful day, a neighborhood kid asked Lou Lyman, Frankie's brother, if Frankie had died. Lou thought it was a joke because people had said this many times before. Lou decided to visit his grandmother to laugh about it, but when he got there, it wasn't a joke. Frankie was really gone. He was found in his grandmother's bathroom holding a syringe. He had overdosed on heroin. Frankie was only 25 years old when he passed away on February 27, 1968. Frankie had been trying to turn his life around. He was ready to record a new song the day before he died. But sadly, by the 1980s, 2 other members of the Teenagers had also passed away. Years later, Diana Ross helped bring Frankie's name back into the spotlight by recording Why Do Fools Fall in Love? In 1998, a movie about his life was made. Frankie and the Teenagers were even inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1993, and Frankie received a star on Hollywood's Walk of Fame.
Thank God for guys like this, because of guys like this, guys like us today wouldn't be doing what we're doing today.
Even after his death, Frankie Lyman couldn't find peace. His legacy became a topic of heated debate. because he never divorced any of his wives. This caused a big fight over his inheritance when he passed away. His name, once the voice of young love, became worth millions, but the money he earned never truly went to him while he was alive. Frankie Lymon's hit song, Why Do Fools Fall in Love, is a classic. It's still played today in commercials and movies. Yet while the song kept bringing in money, Frankie never saw a penny from it. He was supposed to get royalties from the song, but his old manager, a man named Levy, had stolen the rights to the song's publishing. Because of this, the royalties were out of Frankie's reach, as earlier mentioned. After Frankie's death, his final wife, Myra, asked Levy for her share of the money, but Levy refused. He argued that Frankie had been married to 2 other women, and they should be involved in the fight over the money too. This led to a long court battle. Myra finally won and received a settlement of nearly $1 million in royalties. It's likely that amount would be much higher today, considering how much the song is still played. Sadly, the 2 teenagers who originally wrote Why Do Fools Fall in Love never saw any of the money either. They had lost their lawsuit because of a legal rule called the Statute of Limitations, which meant they could no longer sue. They had been cheated out of millions. Levy, on the other hand, walked away with what is now worth tens of millions of dollars. Rock and roll, which started as music for teens, found its first big star in Frankie. His group, Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers, was a key part of the 1950s music scene. Their sound helped shape the music that came after them, inspiring groups like the Supremes, the Temptations, and even legends like Michael Jackson and Diana Ross. Frankie's life also shows how much the world still struggles with issues like fairness and opportunity. He was a star, yet the system around him failed him. His story makes you think about how much success really means when the rewards are never properly given to the person who earned them. It's a lesson about fame, fortune, and the unfairness that often follows both.